let's go into a bit more detail on the dependent or the subordinate clause. So remember, a dependent or subordinate clause, in contrast to an independent clause, is a clause that can't stand by itself without creating a fragment. So therefore, you could say that it depends on an independent clause. You need it to complete the full sentence. So there are two main kinds of subordinate clauses I want to look at here. The first is the kind of standard subordinate clause, and that is when you've got a subordinating conjunction, a subject, and then your verb. So some example of subordinating conjunctions include although, because, even though, if, and so on. You can even have some prepositions like after, before, until, and since that can act as subordinate conjunctions and create subordinate clauses. So examples. Although I pretend otherwise, I love practicing for the SAT. So notice, we've got our subordinating conjunction, then we've got our clause, subject, verb. Notice you separate your subordinate clause from the independent with a comma, and that's okay. So you can kind of create a comma splice, so to speak, between an independent and a dependent. That's fine. And so notice this is okay. Notice if I got rid of this, you get a fragment, right? Although I pretend otherwise, what, right? It depends on the rest of the sentence. How about this? Because the company expanded too quickly, it is having cash flow problems. So again, subordinating conjunction, subject, verb, and then we've got our independent clause, subject, verb. Right? So this subordinate clause depends on that. Notice if I flip it around, I don't need the comma. The company is having cash flow problems because it expanded too quickly. When your subordinate clause comes after the independent, most of the time you don't need a comma. You can just leave it off. The other major one, and the one that comes up quite a bit, is the relative clause. So a relative clause has a relative pronoun, which we've talked about already, plus a subject sometimes, and a verb, though often the relative pronoun is the subject. In any event, let's look at some examples. The winger who scored the game-winning goal celebrated with his teammates. So here's our subject. Now, this is our relative clause. Who is a relative pronoun, right? We use it for people. It refers back to the winger. This is the main verb that goes with the subject of this clause, right? So the winger who scored the game-winning goal, right? This whole thing is telling us some information about the winger. It's acting adjectively. The winger who scored the game-winning goal celebrated. This is actually our main verb of the independent clause, and then the rest of the sentence completes. So you have to be able to determine, okay, what parts of the sentence are in the independent clause, which parts are in the relative clause. Another example, the paper, which I read yesterday, blew my mind. So here we've got our subject, our verb, blew. Now, what's a relative clause? Well, which is our relative pronoun. Notice this is an example of a non-restrictive or non-essential clause, which is why it's in commas. We talked about that in a previous video. This refers back to the paper, so it's the paper that I read yesterday. So notice here's the subject of this particular clause, and the verb, and so on. So this would be a relative clause. The main clause is this part. One important thing to remember about relative clauses is that the relative pronoun has to come immediately after the noun it's replacing. And this is one of the errors you might see on the SAT, where the relative pronoun's not quite in the right place. And let me show you an example. The forest fire was caused by an abandoned campfire, which burned down over 1,000 acres of woodland. Now, we've got our subject, the forest fire, our verb, prepositional phrase, then a relative clause, which. So which burned down over 1,000 acres of woodland. So wait a minute. What was it that really burned it down? Was it the abandoned campfire? Well, sort of. I mean, that started the fire, I suppose. But really, this should refer back to the forest fire, right? Because it's the forest fire that burned down over 1,000 acres of woodland. So one way to fix this would be to say the forest fire, which burned down over 1,000 acres of woodland, comma, was caused by an abandoned campfire, right? That would be a way to put your relative clause where it needs to be. And again, that could be an error you see on the SAT.